When we talk about seeing the true self, we are speaking about a journey that is as old as humanity itself. It is a journey that Carl Jung, the great psychologist and philosopher, dedicated much of his life to understanding. But what does it mean to see the true self? How can we even approach such a profound question? We live in an age of distraction, where the superficial dominates our lives, yet somewhere deep within, there is a call, a whisper that urges us to look past the illusions and into the depths of who we truly are. Jung believed that the true self is not something we see with our eyes, nor is it a concept we can grasp intellectually. It is not a persona we wear or a role we play. Instead, it is the essence of our being, the core that lies beneath the layers of conditioning, fear, and pretense. But how do we begin this process of uncovering what is hidden? How do we embark on the journey of individuation? The process Jung described as becoming who we were always meant to be. To truly see your true self, you must first confront the parts of yourself that you do not wish to see. This is not an easy task. Jung called this the shadow, the aspects of ourselves that we suppress, deny, or project onto others. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply what we have disowned. It contains both our darkest fears and our hidden potential. To see the true self, we must first integrate the shadow, because the true self cannot exist in isolation from the whole. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you faced your shadow? When was the last time you allowed yourself to feel the full weight of your fears, your insecurities, your anger, or your pain? Most of us spend our lives running from these feelings. We build walls around ourselves, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. But in doing so, we also imprison the light. Jung taught us that the path to the true self is not a straight line. It is a spiral, a labyrinth. We must descend into the depths of our consciousness, into the parts of ourselves that we have buried and forgotten. This is not a journey for the faint of heart. It requires courage, the courage to face what we fear most, ourselves. Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights. But why should we do this? Why not stay on the surface, where life is easier and less painful? The answer is simple, because the surface is not enough. The surface is a mask, a facade. It is not real, and deep down, you know this. You feel it in the quiet moments, in the stillness, when the noise of the world fades away. You feel the emptiness, the longing for something more. That longing is the call of the true self. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But this privilege comes with responsibility. To see your true self, you must be willing to let go of who you think you are. You must be willing to shed the layers of false identity that have been imposed on you by society, by family, by culture. This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of liberation. You might ask, how do I know who I truly am? The answer is not something I can give you. It is something you must discover for yourself. But I can tell you this, the true self is not something you find. It is something you uncover. It is already there, waiting for you. It is like a diamond buried beneath the dirt. The diamond has always been there, but it takes effort to remove the layers of earth that conceal it. And so we must begin the work of excavation. This work is deeply personal, but it is not solitary. Jung believed that the process of individuation, the journey to the true self, requires a relationship. We cannot see ourselves clearly without the mirror of another. But these relationships must be authentic. They must challenge us, provoke us, and most importantly, hold space for us to explore the depths of our being. But here is the paradox. To see your true self, you must first lose yourself. You must let go of the ego, the part of you that clings to control, certainty, and identity. The ego is not the enemy. It is a tool, but it is not the master of your soul. To see the true self, you must surrender to something greater than the ego. You must trust in the process, even when it feels as though you are wandering in the dark. Jung often spoke of the self with a capital S, the archetype of wholeness. The self is not just your individual essence, it is the divine within you. It is the part of you that is connected to the collective unconscious, to the greater whole. To see your true self is to see this connection. It is to realize that you are not separate from the world, but an integral part of it. But how do we access this deeper connection? Jung believed that symbols and dreams are the language of the unconscious. They are the bridge between the ego and the self. Pay attention to your dreams, to the images and symbols that emerge from your psyche. They are not random, they are messages from the depths, guiding you toward your true self. And now I want to ask you something. When was the last time you truly listened to your dreams? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be guided by intuition, by the whispers of your soul? This journey is not about perfection. It is not about becoming something you are not. It is about remembering who you have always been. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you have abandoned. It is about embracing your humanity, your light and your shadow, your joy and your pain. To see your true self is to see the world with new eyes. It is to find beauty in the mundane, meaning in the chaos, and purpose in the struggle. It is to live with authenticity, to act with integrity, and to love without fear. It is not an endpoint. It is a way of being. And so, I invite you to begin this journey. I invite you to look within, to confront your shadow, to embrace your wholeness. I invite you to see your true self not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing reality. Now let us ask, what will you find when you dare to look? If we are to see our true self, then we cannot shy away from the shadow. Carl Jung taught us that the shadow is not an adversary, but a necessary part of our wholeness. Yet most people spend their lives avoiding it. Why? Because the shadow is uncomfortable. It holds everything we'd rather not admit about ourselves, our anger, our jealousy, our fears, our desires that don't align with the image we project to the world. But the truth is, these disowned parts don't disappear just because we ignore them. They linger in the unconscious, influencing us in ways we don't even realize. Think about this for a moment. How many of your reactions are truly yours, and how many are the echoes of something buried? A sharp comment from a friend stings more than it should. A minor inconvenience sets off an outsized frustration. Why? Because the shadow, when ignored, doesn't die. It festers, waiting for moments to erupt in ways that confuse us or make us feel ashamed. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's what the shadow does. It runs in the background, shaping your thoughts, your actions, your relationships, all while you remain unaware of its influence. So if we want to see the true self, we must bring the shadow into the light. This isn't about fighting it or defeating it. It's about understanding it. But how do we do that? Start by noticing the patterns in your life. Pay attention to the things that trigger you, the things that make you uncomfortable. These are not random events. They are clues pointing you toward the parts of yourself that you have disowned. For example, if you find yourself judging someone harshly, ask what it is about them that bothers you so much. Often, what we judge in others is something we cannot accept in ourselves. The shadow loves to hide in projection. It's easier to see our flaws in someone else than to admit they belong to us. But every time we project, we lose an opportunity to learn something vital about ourselves. Recognizing a projection is like catching the shadow in the act. It's a moment of clarity, a chance to reclaim a part of yourself that was lost. Sometimes, the shadow shows up in our dreams. Jung believed that dreams are a direct line to the unconscious. They are not meaningless. They are rich with symbolism, with messages from the parts of ourselves that we ignore during the day. A recurring nightmare, for instance, might be your shadow trying to get your attention. Are you listening? But let's not romanticize this process. Facing the shadow is hard. It can be messy, even painful. It forces you to confront parts of yourself that you've spent your entire life avoiding. You might feel guilt, shame, regret, and yet something remarkable happens when you stop running. The shadow begins to shrink. Its power over you diminishes. It no longer needs to scream for your attention because you're finally listening. Here's the paradox that Jung understood so well. The shadow, when integrated, becomes a source of strength. The anger you suppress can transform into courage. The fear you hide can become wisdom. The parts of yourself you once rejected can become the very things that make you whole. But integration is not the same as control. You don't dominate the shadow, you make peace with it. You acknowledge its existence and allow it to have a voice, but you do not let it take the wheel. It is like welcoming an old adversary to your table and realizing they were never really your enemy. What most people don't realize is that the shadow contains not only the parts of ourselves we dislike, but also the parts we've forgotten to love. How much of your creativity, your spontaneity, your curiosity has been buried because someone told you it wasn't acceptable? How much of your true self has been hidden because it didn't fit the mold of who you were supposed to be? When we repress those parts, we lose something essential. We become smaller, less vibrant, less alive. But when we begin to integrate the shadow, we reclaim those lost pieces. We start to see ourselves in our fullness, not as perfect, but as complete. And this leads us to an uncomfortable truth. The shadow will never go away entirely. Even when you've done the work to integrate parts of it, new aspects will emerge. This is part of being human. We are dynamic, ever-changing beings. The shadow is not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be tended. Now, let's talk about light. If the shadow is what we hide, then the light is what we aspire to. But here's where things get tricky. The light can be just as blinding as the shadow. Jung warned us about the danger of identifying too strongly with the light, with the idealized version of ourselves. This is what he called the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world. The persona is not inherently bad. It serves a purpose. It helps us function in society, maintain relationships, and achieve our goals. But the danger comes when we mistake the persona for the self. When we become so attached to the image, we project that we lose sight of who we really are. Think of the person who prides themselves on being kind and selfless. On the surface, this seems admirable. But what happens when their kindness is driven by a fear of conflict or a need for approval? What happens when their selflessness is a way of avoiding their own needs? The light, when unexamined, can cast its own shadow. So seeing the true self requires not only confronting the shadow, but also questioning the light. It requires asking whether the values you hold, the roles you play, the image you present, are truly yours, or whether they are borrowed, imposed, or performative. This is where things become uncomfortable, because when you start to question the light, you may realize that much of what you thought was you is actually a carefully constructed facade. And if you're not the persona and you're not the shadow, then who are you? Jung would say that you are the self, the wholeness that exists beyond the dualities of light and shadow, good and bad, right and wrong. The self is not something you created. It's something you uncover. It is the part of you that has always been there, waiting beneath the noise. But here's the key. You cannot access the self by rejecting the shadow or clinging to the light. You can only access it by holding both, by recognizing that you are both light and shadow, both flawed and magnificent, both human and divine. This is not an abstract idea. It has practical implications for how you live your life. When you see your true self, you stop being driven by unconscious patterns. You stop being controlled by the need to prove yourself, to be liked, to avoid pain. You begin to act from a place of authenticity, of integrity, of freedom. But freedom is not the absence of responsibility. On the contrary, seeing your true self brings with it a profound sense of responsibility. Not to live up to some external standard, but to live in alignment with who you really are. So let me ask you this. How much of your life is being lived for others? How much of your time, your energy, your identity is tied up in roles that no longer serve you? And more importantly, what would it look like to let that go? When you think about wholeness, it's easy to assume it means perfection. That somehow, to be whole, you must rid yourself of every flaw, every mistake, every dark corner of your mind. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Wholeness is not about perfection. Wholeness is about inclusion. It's about accepting every part of yourself, your light, your shadow, your wounds, your gifts, and allowing them to coexist without judgment. Carl Jung once said, "I'd rather be whole than good." Let that sink in. To seek goodness, as society defines it, often means rejecting the parts of yourself that don't fit the script. You strive to be what others expect, what is admired, what is safe. But to seek wholeness is to embrace the full spectrum of who you are, even the parts that scare you, even the parts that don't make sense. This is not an easy thing to do. It takes courage to stop pretending. It takes courage to stop hiding behind your persona, to stop running from your shadow. It takes courage to admit that you are not always kind, not always confident, not always sure of who you are. But here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying to be something you're not, you create space for your true self to emerge. Think about the masks you wear every day, the one you put on for work, the one you wear with friends, the one you show your family. How much energy do you spend maintaining these masks, these versions of yourself that are carefully curated to fit the moment? And how often do you feel empty after doing so, as if something vital has been left behind? This fragmentation, this splitting of who you are into different roles and faces, is exhausting. And yet, it's what most of us have been taught to do. Society rewards the mask. It rewards conformity, predictability, and the appearance of success, but it does not reward authenticity. To live authentically, to live as your true self, is a radical act. It means stepping outside of the norms and expectations that have been placed upon you. It means being willing to disappoint people, to challenge their perceptions of you, and to risk rejection. But it also means freedom. It means no longer living for the approval of others, no longer being enslaved by the fear of being seen. Freedom, however, comes with responsibility. When you see your true self, you can no longer blame the world for your unhappiness. You can no longer point to others and say, "They made me this way." Instead, you must take ownership of your life, your choices, and your actions. You must accept that you are responsible for your own growth, for your own healing, and for your own transformation. The truth is that we are constantly changing, constantly evolving, and constantly becoming. So the journey towards self-realization never ends. It is a lifelong process of peeling back layers, confronting our illusions, and embracing the fullness of who we are. It's messy, it's difficult, and it's profoundly human. But it is also the most meaningful thing we can do with our lives. And here's the key. When we begin to accept the totality of who we are, the light and the shadow, we move closer to our true self. We become more grounded, more authentic, and more present. We no longer feel the need to hide behind masks or perform for others. Instead, we show up in the world as we are, vulnerable, imperfect, and whole. This doesn't mean that we stop growing or striving for improvement. It means that we stop rejecting parts of ourselves in the name of some idealized version of who we should be. When we accept all aspects of our being, we can begin to create a life that is in true alignment with our inner self. The journey towards self-realization is not about becoming someone different. It is about becoming more of who you already are. It is about rediscovering the parts of yourself that have been buried beneath layers of conditioning, fear, and shame. It is about learning to live with integrity, to trust your own instincts, and to find peace within yourself, no matter what is happening around you. In the end, the question is not who you want to become, but who you are beneath all the layers you've built up over the years. And when you finally strip those layers away, you will find that you have always been whole. You have always been enough.